So you have the different lobes, and then in this outside layer that has the lobes and it has these little valleys running through it is the cerebral cortex. And these valleys have a name, they're sulci, and then the area between them, or the hills, are called gyri. Okay?
And that's the gray matter?
Yeah.
Okay.
And then underneath the cerebral cortex, you can see there's a smooth area, right? So what do you think that's called? That smooth area underneath the cerebral cortex.
Where is it? Which one?
See how it gets smooth? Right, you stop having the sulci.
Corpus callosum?
Corpus callosum.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so that's pretty much the end of the cerebral cortex. The cortex is the outside layer, and then underneath that you sort of have this beginning of the diencephalon, which is divided by the corpus callosum.
So you're saying that the cortex comes up like that, or what?
No, none of this none of this stuff is part of the cerebrum, right? Just this outside layer with the sulci in it are the cerebral cortex, right? Cerebral cortex just means outside layer. Cerebral refers to the fact that we're only talking about the cerebrum. You have the smooth layer, right? That's the corpus callosum, and all that underneath there in here is going to be the diencephalon. So you see underneath the corpus callosum, you have this opening. Okay. You can see it there too. That's the lateral ventricle. Ventricle just means a chamber filled with fluid, right? We'll see it again when we get to the heart. So in this case, it's a fluid, or the fluid filling it is the cerebrospinal fluid. So remember, inside the ventricles is where I said you could find the choroid plexus, which we can't see, but that's what's actually going to be producing that cerebrospinal fluid.
Which is under the
It's yes, inside of the lateral ventricle, right? Okay, so then below the lateral ventricle, you see there's like a circular shaped area. So that circular shaped area is the thalamus, okay? And if you look closely on some of these, you can see it's got a rougher texture on the inside of the thalamus, and that's the intermediate mass. It's essentially just the middle part of the thalamus. So to avoid confusion for you guys, when I ask it on an exam, if I pin it and then I say name this part of the thalamus, it's the intermediate mass. If it's just pinned and it says name this part of the cerebrum or the diencephalon, it would just be thalamus, right? Okay, then you have this region that's sort of above the thalamus, sort of including the lateral ventricle. What's the region above the thalamus called, do you think? In this case, it's what? Look at your handout. Sort of.
corpus callosum.
This is the corpus callosum above the lateral ventricle. Then you have the lateral ventricle, yeah, and then you have the epithalamus, which is just the area around and above it. And then you have this area here, right, but so that's the hypothalamus.
Where is it?
This area below the thalamus is the hypothalamus. Okay. And coming off the back of the thalamus, we have this, see this little flap right there? Yeah, so see this flap coming off? So a lot of times what happens is it comes off only on one side, right? It's not on the other side because it all came off on this side of the brain. But that's the pineal gland, so it's coming off the posterior and superior part of the thalamus, the pineal gland. Okay? And then below the thalamus, on the hypothalamus, you have kind of this stuff right here, which we usually cut all the way through. You can see it better on this one. Right, so see that little part coming off the bottom? Yeah. That's the optic chiasma. It's part of the optic nerve. You can see it from underneath as well. See it coming up like that? Let's see if we can see it on here. So there it is. See how it makes like an X? That's what chiasma literally means, is an X or a cross. It's where the optic nerves cross each other. So the nerve coming out of the left eye crosses and goes to the right hemisphere, okay, and then vice versa. So that's where they cross. Okay, and then usually behind the optic chiasma here, you would have the pituitary gland, but it's really just held in by the meninges. So since the meninges are absent on this one, we lost the pituitary, but on this one you can see it. So see this coming off?
See, that's the
pituitary. Okay. Yeah, so it's behind, here's the optic chiasma, it's just posterior to it.
It's bigger than I thought it
This
would
thing
be.
right here
Oh, okay.
is the optic chiasma, and that's the pituitary. Yeah, it's a really big projection coming off, and it's really just held in by the meninges.
So where was the pineal gland again?
So the pineal gland, if you look on here, here's the thalamus. It's coming off the superior and posterior part. So it's that little flap right there. Yeah. Okay, and then again, like I said, we have the midbrain right here behind the cerebrum. And then behind the midbrain, we have this, okay, which remember was the cerebellum, and you only have to know one part of that. It's this white branching, and that's arbor vitae. Yeah, right, because it looks like a tree, so arbor means tree, tree of life. Below the cerebellum is the brainstem, okay? And when you look at the brainstem, you can see when it starts, it's a little bit wider, where it's first connecting to the cerebrum, and that first wider part is the pons. So you can see it clearly on this one. You can see it's like a little like pucker coming off right there. That's the pons. And then right here, right before it thins out, is the medulla oblongata. So they're just like regions. So the first part is the pons, and then the part right before it
Why
thins
wouldn't
out.
that be the pons? What is that? Is that not
No, that's just part of the
mid?
hypothalamus, because it's still sort of that area below it. It's this first part of the brainstem. Okay. And then the last part you guys need to know are the ventricles. So we already did the lateral ventricle, right? And then you have the third and the fourth. They're really hard to see because the other ones are more like channels that the actual cerebrospinal runs through rather than a big chamber like the lateral ventricle. So the third runs through here between the cerebellum and the midbrain. You can see there's like a little bit of an indentation in there, and that's literally all it is that little indentation.
That's the third?
Yeah, and then the fourth is between the cerebellum and the brainstem. So you kind of have to like look in there, and again you can see there's an indentation running along there.
So fourth, third, lateral?
Yeah. And I'll always say name this ventricle so you guys don't get confused and think I'm just pinning the brainstem or something. Okay.
So they just go from front to back, basically?
Yeah. Cool. And that's pretty much, oh, the other thing I was going to point out, so remember I said you can see two of the cranial nerves on here? So that optic chiasma of the optic nerve was the first one. And then see this weird thing coming off that very anterior and inferior part of the brain? That's the olfactory bulb. So it's part of the olfactory nerve.
The thing looks like a peanut right there.
Yeah, see those things hanging off the front?
Look like little
They
sugar
look like
peanuts.
Yeah, that's the
like when you break them in half?
Yep, that's the olfactory bulb of the olfactory nerve. So I could pin that and ask you which cranial nerve, and pin right here for the optic nerve.
Okay.
So, just before you go,